Hey, welcome back to the channel. It's Eric again, and we are going to be talking about 2016's Moonglow by Michael Chabon tonight. Now, my co-host for this video is Drambuie. This is an aged Scotch whiskey liqueur with heather, honey, herbs, and spices. And I'd never heard of Drambuie until I read Moonglow, and some of the characters drink that with some tea. So I have brewed up some nice orange spice tea, and I'm going to enjoy it with some Drambuie. That ought to do it. Give that a little bit of a swirl. All right. Cheers. That's delicious. 21 and up now, okay? Drink responsibly. Okay, so Moonglow is fashioned as a memoir, but right here on the title page, it says that this is a work of fiction, okay? And as most boilerplates state,
His names, characters, places, and incidents are products of the author's imagination, are used fictitiously or not to be construed as real. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, organizations, or persons living or dead is entirely coincidental.
Scout's honor. Now the thing is, he's writing this as a memoir about his grandmother and his grandfather. Primarily about his grandfather. Let me just get another sip of this. And after I read the book the first time, I found myself wondering how much of this book is real. Some of these stories seem fantastical. Could this really have happened? And so I did some digging, and I found an article in the Calgary Herald Online, and it says this. Here, let me read it. Chabon says, "I love that feeling when you're reading a work of fiction and you just find yourself wondering how much of this is true. On some level, you know this is a work of fiction, and likely it's all or primarily invented. There's almost a childlike desire to have it all be true. That combination of wanting to believe and knowing that you're being deceived is something I find very pleasurable, and something I thought I could get in a direct and efficient way by having this narrative pose as a non-fictional narrative." So though he doesn't exactly answer that question head on in that interview, it kind of gives me the idea that this probably isn't all the truth, right? It was only later when I watched an interview with him online where he states that the story that opens the book about his grandfather being fired from his job to make room for Alger Hiss, that we find out as readers that this has largely been invented. That story didn't even happen to his grandfather. That was a story that he'd heard about his grandfather's brother. He just recharacterized that story as happening to his grandfather because he felt that was more intimate to speak about his grandfather. And even for Michael Chabon, he finds out that his cousins hadn't even heard the story the same way he had. They'd never heard that anybody was fired to make room for Alger Hiss, only that Alger Hiss had come to work one day. And he was just working there. He's like, "Hey, I'm one of you guys now." So even from Michael Chabon's perspective, which version of that story is true? Does it really matter? And that question, does it really matter, is what is at the core of Moonglow. And I think that explains why Michael Chabon's a little cagey when he's asked these kinds of questions in interviews. He doesn't just say that this is true and this is false and this is how much of the facts that I twisted and this is the actual true part. He doesn't get into that because that's not really the point. Our family histories are in some part false, and we all know that. How many times have you sat around with your family, with your brothers or sisters or your cousins or your mom or dad, and you're talking about something that happened when you were little kids, and you're telling this funny story, and you're talking about how your dad walks into the room and he spills the popcorn all over the floor and everyone's laughing or whatever, and then your brother says, "What are you talking about? Dad wasn't there." And then your sister says, "The spilled popcorn thing, that was grandma, but that was at Christmas." And so like everybody's got these slightly different versions of the story. Like it's all there, right? We all remember our father and we remember our grandma and we remember somebody spilled popcorn at one point, but it all gets mixed up and distorted over time. Our memories are not reliable, and nor are the memories of our family members. So our family history is a conglomeration of all these faulty narratives coming together to form this very incomplete picture of our ancestors and of ourselves. That was a lot to say. Okay. Oh, man, you got to try this Drambuie. Okay, so what is this book even about? This is a memoir about Michael Chabon's grandmother and grandfather. They aren't given names in this book, so I'm just going to call them the grandmother and the grandfather. And because there's so much fictional distance between Michael Chabon and the person that he writes himself as into this book, I'm just going to call him the narrator when I'm talking about the Michael Chabon who's in this book, okay? If I mention Michael Chabon, I'm talking about the author who wrote the book. The Michael Chabon in the book is the narrator. Okay. So we first see the grandfather as a young child growing up in Philadelphia, and he's a bit of a troublemaker. And we don't linger too long on him there, just long enough to learn that he's got this moral code. He's kind of a stoic even as a young child. Now, the book doesn't follow a linear progression of events, and so it goes back and forth, and it follows the grandmother and it follows the grandfather for a time. But I'm going to follow it in a linear fashion just for the sake of this video. And so the next time we see him, he's joined the army. And because of some very funny hijinks he gets involved in with some of his junior officer friends, he's whisked away into this intelligence group. Instead of punitive action taken against him because of these hijinks, this trouble that he got into, they saw his troublemaking for the genius thinking that it was, and they sent him into this intelligence field. He's working this place called Area B. So at Area B, he's learning mayhem and spycraft, and he's building like pen guns like you'd see in James Bond, and they're developing this magnetic paint for limpet mines and cool stuff you'd see in spy movies, right? From there, he goes off to Germany, and he's involved in something called Operation Paperclip. Now, the grandfather's role in Operation Paperclip was to lead a small group of men through Germany, and they're tasked with finding as much German technology and intelligence, like paperwork and that kind of thing, and to capture as many like German scientists as possible. So anyway, without going into all the details of this book, the grandfather and his men travel across Germany, and they get into these little series of adventures, and it's immensely readable. And it's a lot of fun to get into, and I don't want to spoil any of it for you. These adventures lead the grandfather to trying to track down Wernher von Braun. And Wernher von Braun was the German scientist in charge of the V2 rocket program. Now, a thing about the grandfather that we're reminded of frequently is that he has a love of astronomy and rocketry. Now, he sees this opportunity to bring Wernher von Braun back to America as an opportunity to capture a kindred spirit and bring him over to the good guy side, right? So he travels across the country, and he's gone off in search of Wernher von Braun. And when he arrives at a place called Nordhausen, and this is a place that I had not heard of, his whole opinion of Wernher von Braun is totally shattered. He's totally reminded that this is a Nazi officer, and he's part of the Third Reich, because Nordhausen is a working concentration camp. There's 60,000 prisoners of war there. Half of them died in the camp. They were Poles and Russians and Ukrainians, Frenchmen. The conditions were just as bad as anything you've ever heard of. And many of the prisoners were just summarily executed because the Germans were afraid of sabotage. It was just a nightmare facility. And the grandfather arrives there a day after liberation, and there's just death everywhere. And he cannot hold Wernher von Braun in high esteem, no matter how brilliant the man's mind is. You cannot take credit for the scientific achievement without also shouldering the shame of the program. In the decades that follow World War II, he boycotts the space program. He won't watch it because Wernher von Braun is now working with NASA. He's developing the Saturn V rocket that puts the Apollo mission on the moon. He won't watch the moon landing on television. He's got this grudge against Wernher von Braun, and for good reason. But this anger and how the grandfather deals with anger is one of the central themes to the book. Not all anger and lifelong hatred needs to culminate in a huge explosion. Sometimes we must learn to let that anger diffuse. All right, I've said really too much about the plot already. This book really covers a lot of ground, and it's 430 pages. I don't want to go into too much of it. I've made it sound like this is a World War II book, and a third of it is, but the rest of it is not. There is a lot more to this book. The grandmother character is an incredibly dynamic person. She is just as well-rounded as the grandfather, even though she's on screen for half the time. She suffers a particularly disturbing brand of mental illness. She feels like she's pursued by a tormentor, and she sees faces in the mirror and hears voices, and but it's not all the time. And when she's not being tormented, she is a delightful woman. So anyway, Michael Chabon handles the topic of mental health with a lot of authenticity. These characters are compelling all the way through to the end. And again, I'm put in mind of the question, how much of this is real? Was any of this stuff about World War II real? Is any of this stuff about the grandmother's tormentor real? How much of this actually happened? And I have to keep reminding myself that it doesn't really matter. Michael Chabon said in an interview that one of the greatest attributes of literature is that it teaches empathy. Literature teaches us empathy, where other nonfiction doesn't. And where historical nonfiction is concerned with reporting the truth of what happened, getting to the accuracy of events, a fictional memoir is more about eliciting empathy for a type of person. And the grandfather and grandmother are types of people that may well exist. Michael Chabon says that this book is a lie that tells the truth. Even if he's distorting the facts or entirely inventing the facts, I'm left with this enormous feeling of empathy for them. And when I look at the grandfather and how he overcame his anger and how he accepted his wife for all of her mental illnesses and just wanted her to be at peace, and how I look at the grandmother and how she disguised her own life, and there's a big part of the book that I haven't talked about. It's kind of the purpose of the book, really, but I don't want to get too much into it. But it's hinted at that she may have been lying about her own life. And how much of that was true? Was she really lying about her life to Michael Chabon, or was that just something that the grandmother was lying to the narrator about? I don't know. It all comes down to this unreliable narrative that we know about our family histories. The fact of the matter is that it doesn't change what we know about the person, how we feel about the person. It doesn't matter if the events of that person's lives are reordered or fabricated in any way. What we know and what we feel about a person is what is important. I've never read a book that has tackled that very nebulous theme before. Even after reading this book 3 times and writing a 4,500 word essay about this book, which I haven't been able to use, I still don't know how to put this into succinct language. It is a difficult book to talk about, but it is a wonderfully delightful book to read. And I absolutely recommend this to everybody. I think anyone would find something in this book that they'll like. So, Moonglow by Michael Chabon. Absolutely recommend this. And can't wait to read more from him. So, if you liked this video, go ahead and tell me that you liked it by hitting that like button. Tell the algorithm you liked it by hitting the like button. That really helps my channel a lot. Subscribe to this channel for more videos like this. I try to put out a video every week. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you. I'm just going to enjoy this now.